At dawn on October 15, 1943, precisely at 6:27 in the morning, Lieutenant Colonel William Shomo sat low in the cockpit of his P-39 Airacobra, just 300 feet above the black, glassy surface of Rabaul Harbor, staring through his gunsight at a line of Japanese supply barges. These were the same barges that had been delivering vital supplies to enemy forces for months, untouched and uncontested by American pilots. At only 31 years of age, Shomo served as the commanding officer of the 7th Fighter Squadron and had not yet recorded a single confirmed barge destruction. He flew an aircraft that Pacific pilots universally mocked and dismissed as worthless, the Bell P-39. The Airacobra was the airplane no one wanted, too slow to compete in dogfights, unable to climb beyond 20,000 feet without gasping like a worn-out truck, and handling in the air like a concrete block with wings attached. When Shomo's squadron had first been issued their Airacobras at Henderson Field 6 months earlier, the reaction from his own pilots had been audible groans of disappointment. Major General Funch openly brushed the aircraft aside as nothing more than a ground attack toy and warned Shomo to keep his so-called flying coffins far away from real combat missions. Other squadron commanders joked that the P-39 posed its greatest danger to the man sitting inside it. Even the maintenance crews referred to it as a flying catastrophe, pointing to its bizarre layout with the engine placed behind the cockpit and a massive 37mm cannon protruding from the nose like a failed scientific experiment. That cannon alone weighed 400 pounds and fired shells meant to destroy tanks, not aircraft, rounds so heavy they robbed the plane of even more speed. Every fighter pilot in the Pacific understood the unbreakable rules of aerial combat: speed decides survival, altitude determines victory, and maneuverability is what keeps you alive. The Airacobra possessed none of those qualities. Yet as Shomo aligned his attack run on the lead barge, watching Japanese troops race across its deck piled high with ammunition crates and medical supplies, he was on the verge of learning that the most despised weapon can sometimes become the most terrifying. The Japanese had no understanding of what the aircraft's nose-mounted cannon was capable of doing to a wooden supply vessel at close range. When the Bell P-39 Airacobra arrived at Henderson Field in March of 1943, it was treated like an unwanted relative showing up uninvited. Lieutenant Colonel William Shomo observed his pilots walking slow circles around the aircraft with the detached curiosity of morticians inspecting a particularly troublesome body. The airplane rested on the coral runway atop its tricycle landing gear, an unusual feature that unsettled experienced aviators, while the enormous 37mm cannon barrel jutted from the propeller spinner like a cold, metallic accusation. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, the squadron's chief mechanic, ran a hand along the fuselage and shook his head before remarking that the aircraft had its engine mounted behind the pilot and a cannon placed where the engine should have been, as if someone had assembled it backward. The technical specifications only deepened the pessimism. The Allison V1710 engine produced 1,150 horsepower, respectable on paper, but positioned behind the cockpit it created a disastrous center of gravity problem that caused the aircraft to fly like a weighted seesaw. Its top speed reached 377 miles per hour at sea level, but that figure collapsed to a miserable 290 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, the altitude where much of the air fighting in the Pacific took place. The service ceiling was officially rated at 20,000 feet, yet pilots quickly learned that climbing beyond 15,000 feet turned the Airacobra into what Captain John Wrigley memorably described as a flying anvil suffering from delusions of. The airplane's operating distance of roughly 500 miles was sufficient for short-range duties. However, across the enormous Pacific theater, where sorties often required traveling hundreds of miles over empty ocean, pilots felt as though the fuel needle was dropping faster than the speed indicator could rise. Major General Enzo Fucci left no doubt about his thoughts during his initial inspection of the unit. He slowly circled Shomo's plane, his hands folded behind him, pausing to stare at the nose-mounted cannon with clear displeasure. "Colonel, this is the result of engineers attempting to redesign something that never needed changing. What we require are fighters capable of rapid climbs and high-altitude combat, not airborne artillery platforms." Fucci struck the nose landing gear with his boot and continued. "The Japanese Zero can climb 3,000 feet per minute faster than this aircraft and can outrun it once above 15,000 feet. So tell me, what purpose is this supposed to serve?" Shomo had been wrestling with that very question for several weeks. The 7th Fighter Squadron had recently switched from the P-40 Warhawk, an aircraft that could not compete with Japanese fighters, yet still felt like a true combat plane. By comparison, the Airacobra felt like an unwanted compromise. Its 37mm M4 cannon had been intended for destroying tanks on European battlefields, launching high-explosive shells at a velocity of 2,800 feet per second. Each projectile weighed 1.5 pounds, more than the combined weight of many machine gun rounds, and the weapon carried only 30 shells. In air combat, where ammunition was expended in seconds-long bursts, 30 rounds felt equivalent to bringing a single-shot rifle into a fight dominated by machine guns. Lieutenant Edward C.S. captured the squadron's irritation during a pilot briefing in early April. "Sir, we trained on this aircraft for 6 weeks at Hamilton Field, and I still don't understand its intended role. The cannon is excellent if the goal is punching holes in structures, but try hitting a maneuvering zero with it, you'll empty all 30 rounds and hit nothing but open sky. The machine guns are standard .50 caliber, nothing exceptional. And good luck positioning yourself for a shot when every Japanese fighter can climb faster and fly quicker than you." The Airacobra's unconventional layout caused difficulties that extended far beyond simple performance statistics. The location of the engine placed the propeller shaft beneath the pilot's seat, linking it to the forward-mounted propeller through a 10-foot-long drive shaft that passed directly between the pilot's legs. While this configuration created room for the nose-mounted cannon, it also introduced a serious risk, as any combat damage to the drive shaft would result in a freely spinning propeller and a total loss of engine power. The aircraft's tricycle landing gear provided greater stability during taxiing, takeoff, and landing compared to traditional taildragger designs, but this advantage came at the cost of increased weight and mechanical complexity, burdens the aircraft could ill afford. Training exercises exposed these shortcomings in harsh clarity. In simulated dogfights against Marine Corps F-4U Corsairs based at Henderson Field, the Airacobras were repeatedly outmatched at every altitude above 10,000 feet. The Corsairs could simply climb out of any encounter, leaving P-39 pilots to rehearse defensive maneuvers while hoping their adversaries would commit errors. Captain Wrigley documented these outcomes in his flight report. Attempted interception of a mock bomber formation at 18,000 feet. By the time my aircraft reached the required altitude, the bombers had already completed their attack and were en route back to base. Rate of climb above 15,000 feet proved inadequate for successful combat missions. The effect on squadron morale was swift and deeply damaging. Pilots who had devoted months to preparing for high-altitude interception roles suddenly found themselves flying an aircraft incapable of reaching the heights where air combat actually took place. Japanese forces retained air dominance in part because they could control when and where engagements occurred, climbing to elevations that American fighters found difficult to attain. Flying the Airacobra made U.S. pilots feel as though they were being sent into battle with a severe handicap. Shomo observed his pilots' confidence steadily decline after each training sortie. These were seasoned combat airmen who had successfully completed missions in P-40s and P-38s, individuals who understood aerial combat doctrine and had endured months of fighting in the Pacific. Yet the Airacobra reduced them to feeling like novice flyers once more, wrestling with an aircraft that seemed hostile at every maneuver. Under combat conditions, the aircraft's peculiarities became even more pronounced. Firing the cannon produced recoil that slowed the plane and disrupted its flight trajectory. The substantial weight of the ammunition altered the center of gravity as shells were expended, while the unconventional engine location generated unfamiliar vibrations and noises that complicated the identification of mechanical faults while airborne. By the end of April, readiness assessments delivered an unmistakable verdict. Out of 24 aircraft assigned to the squadron, only 18 were operational on any given day, largely due to maintenance problems associated with the intricate drivetrain system. Pilot skill evaluations had declined when compared to their performance in earlier aircraft, and training exercise success rates were the lowest within the fighter group. The Airacobra was not merely failing to meet expectations, it was actively reducing the squadron's combat capability at a moment when every plane in every mission was vital to preserving American air dominance in the Pacific. The conflict was being fought across 3 dimensions, and the ASU P-39. The Airacobra appeared incapable of intercepting even 2 of the barges. This understanding did not come from headquarters directives or training manuals, but from a perilous mission that no one was eager to undertake. On the morning of May 12, 1943, intelligence reported a convoy of Japanese-supplied barges moving under the cover of darkness along the channel between Guadalcanal and New Georgia. These were not warships or swift transports, they were wooden vessels, 60 to 80 feet long, loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements destined for isolated Japanese garrisons. The barges hugged the shorelines and traveled exclusively at night, making them almost impossible for conventional bombers to strike accurately. Lieutenant General George Kenney's staff had been grappling with the barge problem for months. High-altitude bombing runs often missed their targets, wasting valuable ordnance on empty water while the barges completed their nightly supply missions unharmed. Dive bombers such as the SBD Dauntless could engage individual barges, but they remained highly vulnerable to Japanese fighters and could not linger over target areas long enough to tackle entire convoys. B-25 Mitchell bombers conducting skip bombing attacks achieved some success, yet these missions required multiple aircraft to destroy targets that, in theory, smaller, more nimble fighters should have handled efficiently. 3 days after the latest intelligence update, Shomo stood in Kenny's office at Port Moresby, facing a wall map densely dotted with red pins marking successful Japanese barge runs. Kenny gestured toward the clusters around Rabaul and the Northern Solomons. "Colonel, we are losing this logistics war one barge at a time. Every night, 20 to 30 of these vessels transported the supplies that kept Japanese forces in the field operational. Our bombers could not strike them reliably, and our fighters lacked sufficient firepower to make a meaningful impact." Turning away from the map, he fixed Shomo with an unwavering gaze. "I want you to take your Airacobras down to wavetop level and test what that cannon can do against wooden barges." The mission defied anything found in standard fighter pilot manuals. Rather than climbing to traditional intercept altitudes, the Airacobras would fly below 500 feet, tracing the coastline until they located enemy barge convoys. Instead of engaging in fast-paced dogfighting maneuvers, they would conduct slow, calculated firing passes, employing the 37mm cannon with the precision of a sniper against each individual vessel. The aircraft's usual deficiencies, limited high-altitude capability and sluggish climb rate, became irrelevant in this new operational context. Its most conspicuous liability, the massive nose-mounted cannon, now appeared to be a potential advantage. Shomo devoted 2 days to studying barge construction and analyzing vulnerability reports compiled by Navy intelligence. Japanese supply barges were constructed from tropical hardwoods, reinforced with steel plates around critical sections such as the engine compartment and steering station. They typically carried between 15 and 30 personnel alongside their cargo, with most vessels mounting at least one heavy machine gun for defensive purposes. The barges proved remarkably durable. Fire from .50 caliber machine guns could cause damage, but rarely resulted in rapid destruction, often allowing crews to beach damaged vessels and recover their cargo. By contrast, the 37mm M4 cannon fired armor-piercing and high-explosive shells engineered to penetrate tank armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. When used against wooden vessels, the ammunition was vastly more powerful than necessary, but that excess strength could actually benefit the squadron. A single high-explosive shell had the potential to tear a hole in a barge's hull large enough to sink it within minutes, while armor-piercing rounds could blast through reinforced sections that normally resisted machine gun fire. Lieutenant C.S. volunteered for the first trial mission, joined by Captain Wrigley and 2 additional pilots. They departed Henderson Field at 1,600 hours on May 16, heading northwest toward the Japanese-controlled coastline of New Georgia. According to the flight plan, they would descend to wavetop altitude roughly 20 miles from the target area, then track south along the coast while maintaining strict radio silence. If barges were located, each aircraft would conduct individual attacks, making a single firing pass before pulling away to evaluate the results. The difficulties of low-altitude flight became clear almost immediately. Flying at 500 feet and 300 miles per hour, the Airacobras covered distance rapidly, but navigating by visual landmarks demanded constant concentration. Islands, reefs, and shorelines that appeared clearly defined on maps blurred into confusing stretches of green jungle and white surf. Radio navigation aids were scarce, and the aircraft's compass became unreliable near the magnetic disturbances common around volcanic islands. CS sighted the first barge at 1,745 hours, a lone vessel moving slowly along the New Georgia coast approximately 2 miles offshore. The wooden hull was painted dark green with uneven brown blotches, rendering it nearly invisible against the jungle until sunlight glinted off its wake. CS radioed his wingman and began a wide turning maneuver to line up his attack, descending to less than 200 feet above the water. The barge's crew noticed the approaching Airacobra and immediately returned fire with what appeared to be a 25mm automatic cannon mounted amidships. Tracer rounds streaked toward CS's aircraft, forcing him to weave left and right as he closed in on firing range. At 800 yards, he aligned the barge in his gun sight and squeezed the cannon trigger. The first 37mm shell splashed into the water 50 yards short, sending a geyser of white foam into the air. The second shell struck the barge just ahead of the steering station, and the entire vessel appeared to disintegrate in a cloud of smoke and flying debris. The high-explosive round had detonated inside the cargo hold, which evidently contained ammunition or fuel. Secondary blasts rocked the hull, and within 30 seconds the barge was sinking by the stern, its bow pointing skyward. Survivors abandoned ship immediately, leaping into the water as the vessel slipped beneath the surface. CS circled once to confirm the destruction, then rejoined his formation for the return flight to Henderson Field. That evening's mission debriefing became a turning point for the squadron's understanding of their aircraft. A single 37mm shell had achieved what normally required multiple bombing runs or extended strafing attacks. The cannon's enormous rounds proved ideal for destroying lightly armored vessels, and the Airacobra's stable gun platform allowed far greater precision than faster, more agile fighters. Most significantly, the low-altitude attack profile leveraged the aircraft's strengths while entirely avoiding its high-altitude shortcomings. Within 48 hours, Kenny authorized expanded barge hunting operations, assigning specific coastal patrol sectors to Shomo's squadron. Missions would be conducted at dawn and dusk, when Japanese barges were most active, and aircraft would fly in pairs to provide mutual support against defensive fire. For the first time since receiving their Airacobras, the 7th Fighter Squadron had discovered a mission that perfectly matched their aircraft's capabilities. The operation that would silence skeptics launched at 0530 hours on October 15, 1943, with intelligence pinpointing the largest Japanese barge convoy of the month. The convoy consisted of 12 vessels carrying ammunition and medical supplies destined for isolated garrisons on Bougainville. It was moving in full daylight, guarded by 40 fighters and operating under the assumption that American aircraft posed no real threat during its exposed passage across Empress Augusta Bay. Shomo led 8 Airacobras toward the interception point, flying at wave-top altitude to remain below Japanese radar coverage on the surrounding islands. Major General Fuchi had clearly stated his stance during the mission briefing 3 hours earlier. Standing before the assembled pilots at Henderson Field, he gestured toward aerial reconnaissance images that displayed the convoy's defensive formation. This operation perfectly illustrates my concerns about the P-39's shortcomings. 12 well-defended targets with fighter escort. You'll be fortunate to damage 2 or 3 barges before the Zeros intervene. I'm approving this mission despite my serious reservations. His remarks lingered in the early morning air like a provocation, and every pilot felt the burden of proving the value of their aircraft. The convoy came into view at 0715, precisely where intelligence reports had forecast. 12 wooden barges were arranged in 3 columns, each roughly 70 feet long and equipped with at least 1 heavy machine gun. The lead vessels bristled with extra armament, including what appeared to be 20mm automatic cannons and multiple machine gun emplacements. Overhead, for Japanese Zeros maintained a loose combat air patrol at 8,000 feet. Confident that any American fighters would be forced to climb through their defensive umbrella, Shomo designed a plan that exploited the single advantage his aircraft possessed: the ability to strike from sea level while the defending fighters remained high above. The Airacobras would approach the convoy from the south, blending into the dark water until the final possible moment. Each pilot was assigned an individual barge to attack, making a single firing pass with the 37mm cannon before immediately dropping back to wavetop altitude to evade the diving Zeros. Since altitude and maneuverability were lacking, speed and surprise would have to take their place. 5 miles from the convoy, Shomo transmitted the attack command over the radio. 8 Airacobras fanned out into a line abreast formation, each aircraft lining up on a separate target vessel. The Japanese barges maintained their steady course, seemingly unaware of the approaching danger until Lieutenant CS fired at 200 yards. His first 37mm shell struck the lead barge just behind the bow gun position, and the vessel detonated in a dramatic explosion that hurled debris hundreds of feet into the air. Defensive fire from the convoy erupted instantly. Every barge capable of bringing weapons to bear unleashed machine gun fire and automatic cannon rounds, saturating the sky with tracers and bursting shells. Captain Wrigley jerked his aircraft to the left as 20mm rounds bracketed his flight path, then steadied himself for his own attack run. At 800 yards, he fired his cannon and watched 2 high-explosive shells rip through the target's hull just below the waterline. The barge immediately began to list, its crew abandoning their positions as seawater poured into the cargo compartment. High above the engagement, the 4 Japanese Zeros rolled into steep diving attacks against the American fighters. However, the Airacobras had already finished their firing passes and were fleeing at sea level, their cannon shells having struck with devastating accuracy. 6 Japanese barges were already sinking or immobilized, victims of precise attacks that conventional fighters could not have accomplished. The powerful 37mm shells, originally engineered to defeat German tanks, proved just as deadly against wooden vessels packed with ammunition and fuel. The Zero pilots now faced a tactical dilemma with no viable solution. The American aircraft were operating at altitudes where Japanese fighters could not sustain effective combat speeds, and every attempt to engage the Airacobras forced the Zeros to dive down through the defensive fire of their own ships. Lieutenant Yamamoto, commanding the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, tried to intercept Shomo's aircraft as it pulled away from the convoy, but the American pilot simply pushed his nose toward the sea and accelerated out of danger. While the Zero held clear advantages in climb rate and top speed at higher altitudes, those advantages diminished significantly at sea level. Shomo then turned back for another attack pass, this time selecting one of the convoy's escort vessels, a larger barge equipped with twin 20mm cannons and apparently transporting a full company of infantry. Defensive fire was fierce, with tracer rounds weaving a visible lattice around his aircraft, yet the Airacobra's steady gun platform enabled him to hold his aim despite the turbulence. At 600 yards, he fired 3 shots in quick succession. The first shell splashed into the water just ahead of the target, throwing up a tall plume. The second struck the barge's engine compartment, bringing the vessel to an immediate halt. The third round penetrated the main cargo hold and detonated among stacked ammunition crates. The resulting blast could be seen from 20 miles away. The barge was completely torn apart in a column of fire and thick black smoke, destroying its entire cargo and crew. Secondary detonations continued for several minutes as ammunition cooked off, sending streams of tracer fire in every direction like a deadly fireworks display. The psychological impact on the remaining barges was immediate. 2 of the vessels broke formation and turned toward the nearest shoreline, abandoning the convoy rather than risk another attack pass. By 0800 hours, the engagement was effectively finished. Of the 12 Japanese barges that had begun the transit, 9 were sinking or had already disappeared beneath the waves. The 3 remaining craft attempted to flee toward the protection of a small island 5 miles to the north, but their reduced speed made them vulnerable to follow-on strikes. The 4 Zero fighters succeeded in damaging a single Airacobra. Lieutenant Peterson's aircraft suffered cannon hits in the wing root that impaired aileron control, yet all 8 American fighters managed to return safely to base. The mission's results were impossible to dispute. 8 P-39 Airacobras had destroyed or disabled 75% of a major enemy supply convoy in less than 30 minutes. The aircraft, once dismissed as too slow for fighter combat, had demonstrated devastating effectiveness in its newly adopted role as a precision ground attack platform. Even more significant, the mission had been completed without the loss of a single American aircraft, despite determined fighter opposition and intense defensive fire. Barucci was waiting at Henderson Field when the squadron landed, standing beside the operations truck with his arms folded and his expression difficult to read. As Shomo climbed down from the cockpit, the general approached and inspected the empty 37mm shell casings scattered around the aircraft. Each Airacobra had fired between 15 and 20 rounds, more than half of its total ammunition supply, yet the accuracy achieved had been remarkable. Almost every shell that struck its target resulted in a mission kill, sinking or disabling vessels that would have required repeated bombing runs to eliminate using conventional ordnance. 6 hours later, the intelligence evaluation arrived, confirming exactly what the pilots had witnessed during their attack passes. The destroyed convoy had been transporting enough ammunition to sustain Japanese forces on Bougainville for 3 weeks, along with medical supplies urgently needed by isolated garrisons throughout the northern Solomons. This loss caused a major disruption to Japanese logistical operations, forcing enemy commanders to depend on submarine resupply missions that were far more hazardous and considerably less dependable than surface transport. The Japanese reaction to the October 15 massacre was swift and resourceful. Within 72 hours, reconnaissance flights reported that enemy barge movements had shifted from daytime travel to strictly nocturnal operations, with vessels now sailing only during the darkest pre-dawn hours. Even more concerning, Japanese engineers had begun disguising major supply barges with elaborate overhead netting and artificial vegetation, rendering them almost invisible from the air when beached along jungle coastlines during daylight. Lieutenant Commander Tishiro Nakamura, a staff intelligence officer with the Imperial Japanese Navy's 11th Air Fleet, examined the wreckage of the destroyed convoy with increasing alarm. The accuracy of the American attacks and the overwhelming effectiveness of large-caliber cannon fire signaled a fundamental change in tactical capability. His report to Admiral Kusaka was stark and unambiguous: the enemy has developed an effective counter to our barge operations. Unless immediate adjustments were made, Japanese forces risked losing the ability to resupply their forward positions. Adaptation came in multiple ways. Barge crews began installing additional anti-aircraft weapons, turning supply vessels into floating gun platforms bristling with 20mm cannons and heavy machine guns. Engineering units constructed deceptive channels and concealed anchorages along the coast, allowing barges to vanish entirely during vulnerable daylight hours. Most critically, Japanese fighter squadrons received orders to conduct low-altitude combat air patrols specifically designed to intercept American ground attack missions. Shomo first encountered these new tactics during a dawn patrol on November 2. His four-aircraft formation was searching for barges along the New Georgia coastline when Lieutenant CS spotted what appeared to be a single vessel moored in a small cove. As the Airacobras descended for their attack run, the surrounding jungle erupted with anti-aircraft fire from concealed positions. The single barge had been bait, 6 additional vessels lay hidden beneath camouflage netting strung between the trees, and the entire cove had been transformed into a deadly anti-aircraft trap. 20mm shells bracketed CS's aircraft as he pulled up from his firing pass, several rounds penetrating his fuselage and severing hydraulic lines. Captain Wrigley's Airacobra sustained hits to its engine cooling system, forcing him to nurse the overheating aircraft back toward Henderson Field while trailing white vapor. What should have been a routine barge hunting mission became a fighting withdrawal through intense ground fire, with the Americans scoring only 1 confirmed kill against 7 targets. This tactical evolution accelerated throughout November and December. Japanese supply operations had begun employing decoy barges loaded with highly flammable materials that would erupt in spectacular explosions when struck, giving the illusion of successful ammunition hits while concealing real supply vessels nearby. Enemy fighters started executing coordinated low-altitude patrols, forcing American attack aircraft into turning engagements at heights where the Airacobra's performance advantages vanished. On December 8, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, Shomo led his largest barge hunting mission of the war. Intelligence reports indicated a major supply convoy moving toward Rabaul, consisting of 15 barges carrying artillery shells and medical supplies for Japanese forces preparing to resist the expected American invasion. The convoy was escorted by 80 fighters and had plotted a course through the slot that kept it within range of land-based anti-aircraft batteries for the entire transit. The mission plan called for 12 Airacobras to conduct coordinated strikes in 3 flights of 4 aircraft each. Shomo would lead the first wave against the convoy's lead barges, Lieutenant CS would command the second wave to target the center vessels, and Captain Wrigley's flight would engage the trailing barges. All 3 formations were then to rendezvous at low altitude for the return flight. The plan demanded precise timing and flawless navigation, as any delay would expose the slower Airacobras to concentrated enemy fighter attacks. The convoy appeared at 0645 hours, exactly on schedule, but its tactical innovation sent a chill through Shomo. The 15 barges were tightly arranged in a defensive formation with overlapping fields of anti-aircraft fire, each vessel armed with more weapons than intelligence had anticipated. Above them, 80 Japanese fighters weaved in a pattern at 3,000 feet, low enough to intercept diving attackers but high enough to retain their speed advantage. Shomo's initial firing pass destroyed 2 barges with 437mm shells, but the concentrated defensive fire was unlike anything his squadron had previously faced. Tracer rounds streaked through the sky in solid streams, and exploding shells detonated close enough to his aircraft to rattle his teeth. Lieutenant Peterson's Airacobra took a direct hit to the engine compartment, forcing him to ditch in the ocean 3 miles from the convoy. The pilot survived the water landing, but Japanese patrol boats captured him within an hour. The second wave achieved 3 more kills, but at a severe cost. Kao's aircraft sustained multiple 20mm hits that destroyed his cannon and damaged flight controls. He managed to nurse the crippled Airacobra toward friendly territory but was forced to crash land on a small, uninhabited island 40 miles southeast of the battle area. Marine rescue teams did not reach him until the following day, and an infection from his injuries kept him hospitalized for 6 weeks. Captain Wrigley's flight faced the most sophisticated Japanese countermeasures yet encountered. As his 4 Airacobras approached their assigned targets, 6 additional barges emerged from concealment along the coastline, vessels lying in ambush with engines shut down and gun crews at battle stations. The Americans were caught in a crossfire between the convoy's defensive guns and the hidden vessel's weapons. Wrigley's wingman, Lieutenant Barnes, was shot down and killed when a 40mm shell struck his cockpit directly and detonated. The mission's final tally recorded 7 Japanese barges destroyed or heavily damaged, but the cost was devastating: 3 American aircraft lost, 2 pilots killed, and 1 captured, a casualty rate unsustainable for extended operations. Even more concerning was the undeniable evidence that Japanese forces had developed effective countermeasures to the Airacobra's barge hunting tactics. The easy victories of October and early November were clearly a thing of the past. Shomo's after-action report painted a sobering portrait of an enemy whose capabilities were evolving rapidly. Japanese anti-aircraft fire had become more accurate and concentrated, barge crews were better trained and more aggressive, and the coordinated implementation of ambush tactics demonstrated sophisticated operational-level planning. Most importantly, enemy fighter pilots were learning to exploit the Airacobra's vulnerabilities during low-altitude engagements, forcing American pilots into battles that neutralized their aircraft's inherent advantages. The strategic implications were clear to Lieutenant General Kenny, who reviewed the mission reports with growing concern. For nearly 4 months, the P-39 squadrons had been devastatingly effective against Japanese logistical operations, destroying or disabling more than 300 enemy vessels and severely disrupting supply lines across the northern Solomons. Yet the Japanese had adapted with characteristic speed and ingenuity, transforming what had been a one-sided tactical advantage into an increasingly costly war of attrition. The conflict was entering a new phase, and the Airacobra's period of tactical dominance was being challenged by an enemy unwilling to accept defeat without adjusting, learning, and countering with every weapon and innovation available. The pressing question for American commanders was whether the aircraft that had once seemed ideally suited for barge hunting operations could continue to justify its losses against increasingly sophisticated Japanese defenses. Validation did not come from a single, decisive engagement but from the cumulative effect of sustained operations, a truth that only became apparent in the final accounting of the Pacific War. By March 1944, as American forces prepared for their assault on the Marshall Islands, intelligence analysts were compiling comprehensive assessments of the barge war's strategic impact. The statistics painted a picture that even the Airacobra's harshest critics could not ignore. P-39 squadrons had destroyed or disabled more than 800 Japanese supply vessels over 6 months of operations, effectively severing the logistical lifeline that sustained enemy forces across the northern Solomons and Bismarck archipelago. Lieutenant Colonel Shomo stood in Lieutenant General Kenny's office at Port Moresby on March 22, studying a wall chart that tracked Japanese supply movements from October through February. Red pins marked successful barge runs, while black pins indicated vessels destroyed by American attacks. The pattern was unmistakable. Red pins dominated the chart through September, but from October onward, black pins overwhelmed them. Kenny pointed to a dense cluster of markings around Rabaul. "Your squadrons didn't just sink ships, Colonel. You starved an entire theater of operations." The human cost of this success had been significant but manageable. The 7th Fighter Squadron had lost 11 aircraft and 7 pilots during the 5-month barge campaign, a casualty rate painful yet far lower than that experienced by conventional fighter units facing Japanese air defenses. More importantly, the surviving pilots had become masters of a specialized form of warfare that would prove invaluable as American forces advanced deeper into Japanese-held territory. Captain Wrigley, recovered from his injuries and returned to flight status, had developed innovations in low-level attack tactics that were being adopted across P-39 squadrons throughout the Pacific. Major General Fuchi's reassessment of the Airacobra program came in a classified memorandum dated April 5, 1944. His prior skepticism had been replaced by grudging acknowledgement of tactical realities. The P-39 had proven effective in roles that conventional fighter doctrine had never anticipated. While it remained unsuitable for high-altitude air superiority missions, its specialized capabilities had made a decisive contribution to American logistics warfare objectives. The memorandum recommended the continued deployment of Airacobra squadrons in ground attack roles, accompanied by modifications to enhance their survivability against increasingly sophisticated Japanese defenses. The Japanese perspective on the outcome of the barge war was documented in captured reports recovered during the liberation of Rabaul in early 1945. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura's final intelligence assessment, written in February 1944, outlined the strategic consequences from the enemy's viewpoint. American fighters equipped with large-caliber cannons had effectively eliminated the Japanese ability to conduct surface resupply operations during daylight hours. Night operations remained possible but were insufficient to sustain forward positions at required strength levels. The report recommended abandoning advanced positions that could not be supplied by submarine, effectively conceding defeat in the logistical conflict. The broader strategic impact became clear during post-war analysis by the Army Air Force's Historical Division. Japanese forces on Bougainville, cut off from regular resupply due to the destruction of their barge network, were forced to reduce ammunition use by 70% in the campaign's final months. Medical supplies became so scarce that field hospitals conducted surgery without anesthetics, and widespread malnutrition diminished combat effectiveness throughout the garrison. The Airacobra's 37mm cannon accomplished what conventional bombing campaigns could not: the systematic destruction of the enemy's ability to sustain military operations. Lieutenant C.S., promoted to captain and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his innovations in barge hunting tactics, reflected on the campaign during a 1948 interview with Air Force historians. "We learned that the most effective weapon isn't always the fastest or the highest flying. Sometimes it's the one that can hit its target and destroy it with a single shot." The P-39 wasn't built for what we used it for, but it turned out to be perfect for the job. In the end, the aircraft's technical reputation underwent a complete transformation as a result of its unexpected but decisive role in the Pacific theater. Engineering studies conducted at Wright Field in 1945 demonstrated that the Airacobra's design flaws, the rear-mounted engine, the heavy 37mm cannon, and poor high-altitude performance actually became advantages in the low-level attack role. The cannon's recoil, which had destabilized the aircraft in air-to-air combat, helped slow the plane during strafing runs against surface targets. Similarly, the rear-engine configuration, which caused handling difficulties at altitude, provided improved weight distribution for precise low-level flight where the air was denser. Production figures also reflected the evolution of tactical understanding. Bell Aircraft delivered 9,584 P-39 Airacobras during the war, making it one of the most widely produced American fighter types. Initially, these aircraft were assigned to squadrons expecting conventional fighter roles, resulting in dissatisfaction and poor combat records. However, as operational experience highlighted the aircraft's specialized strengths, deployment patterns shifted dramatically. By 1944, new Airacobra deliveries were sent specifically to units conducting ground attack missions, where the aircraft's unique attributes could be fully utilized. The Soviet Union's experience with the Airacobra offered an interesting contrast. Under the Lend-Lease program, the United States delivered 4,746 P-39s to Soviet forces, which employed them primarily for close air support and low-altitude air defense. Soviet pilots, unconstrained by preconceived ideas about high-altitude fighter combat, embraced the aircraft's strengths and achieved remarkable success. Several Soviet aces, including Captain Alexander Pushkin, recorded multiple victories flying Airacobras in roles that American doctrine had initially dismissed. Shomo's final evaluation of the aircraft came during a reunion of Pacific Theater veterans in 1952. When asked about the Airacobra's place in aviation history, he reflected on the stark difference between the designer's original intentions and the operational realities that ultimately defined its legacy. The engineers who designed that airplane never imagined it would spend most of its wartime service flying 50 feet above the ocean, attacking wooden boats with a cannon originally intended for tanks. Yet that was precisely what made it effective. Instead of complaining about what it could not do, pilots discovered what it could accomplish. The P-39's legacy extended far beyond its combat record. Post-war tactical development incorporated lessons learned from the barge hunting campaigns, leading to the creation of specialized attack aircraft designed to prioritize low-level precision over high-altitude performance. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, developed in the 1970s for close air support missions, reflected conceptual similarities to the Airacobra's approach, a powerful cannon mounted in a stable gun platform optimized for ground attack rather than aerial dogfighting. By the end of the war, the aircraft that had once been dismissed as a failure had compiled a record that spoke for itself. In addition to more than 800 confirmed barge kills, Airacobra squadrons destroyed hundreds of trucks, trains, and shore installations throughout the Pacific theater. They provided close air support for amphibious landings, carried out armed reconnaissance missions over enemy territory, and maintained combat air patrols over friendly positions. The 37mm cannon, initially considered an engineering mistake, had proven to be precisely the weapon required for a war nobody had anticipated. The ultimate vindication came in the form of lasting tactical doctrine, which recognized that specialized aircraft could achieve strategic objectives through the focused application of their unique capabilities even when those capabilities differed dramatically from conventional expectations.